right, so now let's move on to our 2-point track. So I'm going to go back into the lecture demos, and I'm going to import under the 2-point track the birds image sequence, and then the nice sky there. All right, and then I'm going to load the birds in the viewer. And again, I'm going to make sure that my viewer is still set to input. This should be 100 frames long, the birds. Now look at this shot here. So let's say we get our notes for this shot, and our lead says the director wants there to be 3 birds on that wire. And he'll give you some story reason why. It doesn't matter, right? Right now there's 2. He wants 1 more bird on the wire. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit and do a little bit of cloning, which we're going to do a lot more in our next lecture, but this is simple cloning that we're doing here. But I want to clone one of these birds and put them next to, or put them in between the 2 birds, so we have 3 birds sitting there. But in order to do that, I need to track this footage, and in this case, not necessarily do a match move, but do what's called a stabilize. Basically remove this camera animation from the image sequence, the camera moving here. Right, so the process is the same, it's just what we export. And if you guys remember from the keynote, I said a stabilize is basically the inverse of your match move. So for example, if you're tracking something that goes up and to the left, the stabilize is going to go down and to the right. It's just going to do the inverse of kind of what you tracked. I know it's hard to see in this shot, but there is a little bit of rotation happening. This was one of the instructors here. He was zoomed in really far, and he was holding the camera like this and holding the lens. So his wrists are kind of moving a little bit. So it's giving a little bit of rotation. It's hard to see, but it is there. So if you guys remember from the keynote, if we need to track for either rotation or scale or both, we need 2-point trackers, right? One's only going to give us translation. We need to have 2. And the reason why is because it compares the difference. Now, typically, when you're tracking for scale and rotation, you want to keep your trackers as far apart as you can. It'll give you a better solve. Now, that being said, every shot's different. So you just have to make kind of these decisions on what you can track and where you can track in the frame. For example, there's really nothing over here on the left side of the frame that's going to be usable to track. If I tried to put a tracker on this power line, there's not enough detail in this. What would happen is that the tracker would slide up and down this line. So I'm going to have to pick 2 areas in the image. I'm going to pick this area here and then this area here to get my rotation. And like I said, this isn't something you always do. You want to try to keep these as far apart as you can, but every shot's different. You're just going to have to kind of make these decisions on what areas you can grab to get the data that you need. So I'm going to do this at the same time. I'm going to tab in a tracker. I'm going to branch this off to the right here. Now I'm going to add the first tracker right up here at the top, right on this little guy. So Option Command, make sure my overlay's on. Option Command click. I'm not even going to adjust the pattern or the search region because that should be good enough. Maybe I'll make my search region a little bit bigger, but that should be fine because there is a lot of movement. And I'm simultaneously going to add a second tracker down here at the bottom. So Option Command click, make my search region a little bit bigger. Right, and before I start tracking, there are some things I need to adjust over here in the properties of the tracker. Obviously, you guys know what TRS means, right? Translation, rotation, scale. That basically means if the pattern's translating, if the pattern's rotating, which in this case it is. So I need to make sure both of these are checked on so the tracker knows to track for that. So I'm going to shift select so both are selected. All right, so let's go ahead and track to the end and see what happens. One of them may fail, they may both fail. We'll need to check them once we're done tracking. Remember, we always want to check our trackers as soon as we're done tracking before we start doing any more work. So mine tracked, they finished tracking, so I need to look at these one at a time. So what I'm going to do is go to track 1 and I'm going to scrub through it. And I'm going to make sure it's sticking where it needs to stick. There's no drift, it doesn't jump, stays exactly where it needs to stay. All right, and then I'm going to go to track 2. So I'm going to highlight track 2 now. I'm going to check this one and make sure it stays exactly where it needs to stay, which it does. So both mine are good. Again, check both of yours, make sure they've tracked all the way through. You'll know they've tracked all the way through because you can look at the timeline and the entire timeline should be blue with keyframe. If it stops and there's no blue or something, that means that tracker failed. Now we need to export our stabilize. So let me show you how this works. I'm going to shift select both of these and export, transform, stabilized. Now I want you guys to notice what this does. So I'm going to show you a before and then an after. So before, here's what the shot looks like. Now, watch the birds, because with the nature of the stabilize, yes, the edges are going to get all messed up, but watch the birds. Okay, so this is before, now this is after. See how I've locked those birds in place? Now it's going to make my cloning a whole lot easier, right? Again, yes, the edges are all getting messed up because, like I said, the stabilize is just doing the inverse of the match move, but it's keeping those birds exactly where they need to be, so now I can do my cloning. All right, and then immediately after your transform stabilized, let's create what's called a roto paint node. You guys haven't used the roto paint node yet. It's a lot like the roto node, but you have additional painting tools that you can use in it. P on the keyboard to create a roto paint node. Again, if you use your groups, it's located in the draw group right up here at the top. And I want to draw an area of where I want my bird to go. So again, like I said, we're jumping ahead a little bit into next lecture with this step, but it's okay. I'm going to select a rectangle. I'm going to say, okay, I want my bird to be right here on the wire. So I'm just going to draw a shape, make sure my overlay's on, draw a shape just like that, making sure that I have enough room at the top and the bottom. Let me close the properties of my tracker so I get that off the screen. Okay. Now, whenever you draw a shape in the roto paint node, first notice that the roto paint node outputs in the color by default, and it always will default to a solid color in these shapes that you draw. But I can change what we see inside this shape. This is how we do the cloning. Yeah, go to the shape tab, because this is essentially a shape, and we're going to set the source not to be color, but background. Now, it looks like I just made the shape transparent, but in reality, what we're seeing inside this shape is a completely different image. It's just lined up with the background, which is why it looks transparent. But I can move around within this shape. So I'm going to go to my clone tab. Put your pivot point over the area you want to clone by holding down Command and just putting it on the bird, and then move it into position here. I want you guys to notice that, see, these birds are doing the exact same thing. They obviously look cloned. Well, your clones can have what's called a time offset. So I can offset this guy to be on a different frame, so it doesn't necessarily look cloned. Now, the problem with this is that, see, I'm 25 frames ahead. So once this gets to frame 75, he's just going to stop moving because he's at the end of the frames. He's already at frame 100. See how he doesn't move anymore? So if you use a time offset, it typically works best if you have a shot where you have additional frames that you're not necessarily using. And that's common, right? Sometimes when you have shots, you'll have frames before and frames after that you're not necessarily working on, but they're still there. And the offset would work better in that case. But you can still offset him. He's just going to hold once he gets to a certain area and not move anymore. So I'm just going to offset him maybe 10 frames, 15 frames. I also want you guys to pay attention to the motion blur. Notice you get motion blur. So this is an issue here happening. Look how the background is blurring, but because he's on an offset frame, he's not blurring. This is difficult stuff you have to deal with. Sometimes you have to try to add it in manually to try to match the blur on just that frame. I always tell my students, if you can make a node, guys, that works in Nuke that removes motion blur, you'd be a millionaire. Right? It's one of the most requested things. If you guys go to Nukepedia, which is a website for compositing artists, the #1 requested node is a node that can remove motion blur. Again, tricks you have to deal with to get over it. We're not going to deal with that. We would just add a type of blur to kind of simulate it. But in this case, we're not going to worry about it. Now, what do we have to do? Well, remember, the note said it wanted 3 birds on the wire. It didn't mention anything about taking the camera move out. So we just stabilized the shot so we could do our paint work a lot easier, or our clone work a lot easier. And now we have to put the camera move back into the shot. All right. Now, the good news is we've already got the tracking done. So go back to your tracker, again, select both, and this time export not a stabilize, but a transform match move, and then add it in right underneath the roto. So now if you look at it, it's going to look like this. We have 3 birds on the wire, and we have the camera move back in the shot. But there's still an issue with it. And look at our edges. We've lost the edges because the nature of how these transforms work is they clip the edges of the frames with black. So if you were to turn these back on, you're still not going to get anything that looks correct. But there's an easy way to fix this. So an easy way to do this is just merge your work over the original. So see, there's our work, and then we just merge it on top of the original, and we get the edges back. So now if I look at this, now we've got 3 birds on a wire. We show this back to our lead, and he's like, you know what? He likes the bird, but he hates the sky. He doesn't like the overcast sky. He wants a different sky. So now we need to do a sky replacement. We've got most of the work done, but we do need to pull a key with this. Now, I want you guys to look at our foreground in this image, and then look at the background sky that's way overexposed and much brighter than anything in the foreground. We want a key based off of the brightness in the image because that background is so overexposed and it's bright. Well, it's an overcast day, but it's much brighter than anything in the foreground. So underneath my merge, I'm going to create a keyer. Remember, the keyer is just what pulls Luma keys. I'm going to hit A on the keyboard. I'm going to adjust my A to get my foreground to be as dark as possible, and then adjust my B to get my background to be as white as possible. Now it's backwards, right, from the way we want it to be, because we want the foreground to be white and the background to be black. So you'll notice in the keyer, right up by output, if we go all the way to the right, we see invert. We invert it, now we get something that looks more like what we're going for. I'm gonna keep adjusting these sliders until I get most of that going. Okay, that looks good. And again, I hit A on the keyboard and I still see the sky. What do I have to do to get my transparency in the color? So after keyer 1, tab in a pre-molt. And yeah, we have some weird edge issues. We're gonna take care of that in a moment. And we'll color correct it to match a little bit more with the background. So we have our image pre-multiplied, all right? Now we need to get our background to kind of match the resolution and how we want it of the foreground. So underneath my nice sky there, I'm going to tab in a reformat, and I'm going to reformat it in its output format to that 960 by 720 with a 1.333333 pixel aspect ratio. Now immediately after that, I'm going to add in a transform so I can scale it up and move it around and place it how I want it. So after the reformat, I'm going to hit T as in Tango or Tom to create a transform. Now I can grab my transform. I can scale this up. I can grab a part of the sky that I want, maybe something like that. And now I can do my merge. So I'm going to merge this A over B. And yeah, the foreground is still, the exposure is off from the foreground as opposed to the background, but we'll fix that in a minute. Notice I don't have any tracking data on the background sky. So if I were to play through this, look what it looks like. Looks kind of bizarre. We already have the tracking data for us, so this is relatively easy. Go back to our tracker, shift select both, export another transform match move, and just add it underneath the transform here. Now you'll see that they're both moving at the same time. We've got our sky in there, matched to our foreground as well. Let's go to the A here. You see we've got this huge bounding box. Let's set our bounding box to be on the A. That way we get rid of the one that's on B. And the last thing I want to do is add a bit of an exposure change on my foreground to match more of the exposure of the background. So I'm going to do this after the pre-molt. Remember what I said our first couple lectures is that you don't want to color correct a pre-multiplied image. You have to be very careful of that. You don't want to color correct the transparency, just the color. Now you can add a color correction after your pre-molt. You just need to make sure in that node you unpre-molt by the alpha. So I'm going to use an exposure node. So just exposure. You could also grab a multiply or a grade node and use the gain or the multiply. It'll give you the same result. And in the exposure node, first thing I'm going to do is down at the bottom when it says unpremult, I'm going to say unpremult by the alpha. You'll notice with the adjust and then you have red, green, and blue, where it says adjust in and it says densities, you see this thing checked on called gang. That just means that these three are locked. So you have individual control on exposure between the red, green, and blue, but with this checked on, they all move together. They're like gang sync together. I'm just going to grab this and drag this down and adjust my exposure to match more of the exposure of the background, something like that. You can see just with some simple tracking, we just did one 2-point track. We did stabilizes and match moves, and we did a little bit of keying and a little bit of cloning. But you can see just how much more you can add to a shot that we initially just had some boring looking shot with a boring sky. We were able to add an additional bird. Now this shot, we're going to finish or stop this shot, but this shot is far from complete. I want you to left drag select it, create a backdrop node, and I want you guys to call this 2-point, and then Command S, save it up.